Joe. We heard from the president a short time ago, but also earlier today I sat down with Larry Summers, director of the National Economic Council, a top economic advisor, also a former Treasury Secretary. I asked him about this plan, and I started by asking him about a central criticism. You just touched on it. Summers saying that it doesn't do enough to reshape the regulatory architecture here in Washington. It is a missed opportunity and only tinkers around the edges. Here's how he responded.
Gee, I think we've made the most fundamental changes in 75 years in the regulatory system. We've assured for the first time that the largest institutions have a regulator accountable for their systemic risk, rather than a lot of different regulators looking at different parts of them. We've assured for the first time that there's a regulator protecting consumers from unsound lending practices, not as a byproduct of other responsibilities, but as the central focus of an agency. We've assured for the first time that there's a proposal in place that will prevent an institution from failing in a chaotic way by allowing a resolution mechanism so that institutions can be resolved, whatever their precise nature. We've provided for the first time a flexible regulatory capacity to respond to new innovations that threaten credibility and threaten systemic stability, as the tremendous growth in over-the-counter derivatives in the last few years did, with really nobody taking any action. So this is a far-reaching set of proposals. You know, we didn't do what some people might have done, which is ask, suppose there was no regulatory system, start completely from scratch. I think that would have delayed passage. I think that would have squandered the experience and institutional capital that exists within a range of our existing agencies. I think it would have carried with it a great deal of risk. But every important problem that was a contributor to this past crisis or to past crises, and every important problem that we believe is potentially going to shape future crises has been addressed. Whether it's too big to fail, whether it's regulatory arbitrage, they're all being addressed in this proposal. So I think it's a very far-reaching proposal.
Let me dig into a couple of details here. You talk about systemic risk and dealing with that. You give a lot of that responsibility to the Federal Reserve. There's already some pushback on the Hill, not just from Republicans. We heard from Senator Mark Warner, a Democrat, today. He has concerns about giving that much power to the Fed. Is this going to be a tough sell?
I'm sure this is going to be extensively debated. It should be. It's very important. But, you know, if you look, the Washington Mutual, Countrywide, some of the most critical situations happened in part because institutions gave up their bank charters in order to escape regulation from the Fed and seek easier regulation elsewhere. So the evidence is that this problem was much more caused by what happened when institutions escaped the Fed's jurisdiction than it was by anything the Fed did. And yeah, we are going to make that kind of regulatory arbitrage harder. I think it's the right thing to do. It brings American practice into line with the kind of responsibilities for financial stability that central banks around the world have.
Let me ask you, at the same time you're giving the Fed more authority, as I read the white paper, one thing stood out to me. You're also taking some authority, or at least limiting the Fed in some way. Going forward, its emergency lending powers, the powers it used with AIG and with Bear Stearns, they need to come to the Treasury to get approval to do that in the future under this plan. Why?
Because that type of lending is ultimately putting taxpayers at risk. There's always some quantum of risk for taxpayers. And in a democratic system like ours, there should be some democratic accountability for that kind of spending. And that democratic accountability is provided through the Treasury Department. And so we think it's important in a democracy to provide for accountability.
Is it an acknowledgement that the Fed perhaps has crossed the line in the last few months?
No, I don't think so at all, because I don't think whatever the merits of the proposals that took place under the Bush administration, I think there's certainly no suggestion that the Fed did anything that Secretary Paulson disapproved of. and certainly Secretary Geithner and Chairman Bernanke have worked closely together. So with respect to the actions that the Fed has taken, I have no doubt that they would have received the approval of the Treasury Department if that had been required. And indeed, if one looks at the process by which they were announced and conceived, it was clear that they had the approval of the Treasury Department. So this is more precautionary in the sense that we don't believe that actions of that kind should be undertaken by a central bank without the approval of the democratically accountable authority.
Is there a risk, however, in opening the Federal Reserve Act up to this change? There are members of Congress, for example, suggesting maybe the Federal Reserve Bank presidents, as a move towards greater accountability, they should be confirmed by the Senate. Is that something the administration would, for example, support as well?
Well, that's certainly not something that's contained in our proposal. There obviously are issues with respect to Federal Reserve governance that may get discussed, but I think it's very important to recognize that the Federal Reserve is a very complex institution that was crafted very carefully with multiple regional banks, with a complicated governance structure, and we'll need to think very, very hard as we address issues. But there's no question that people are entitled to a sense that any regulatory authority is accountable to the broad public interest and not to the interests of the regulated. And so certainly it should be clear that bankers who are involved in being on boards of Federal Reserve banks don't get involved in specific regulatory policies. Questions of that kind certainly are appropriate.
Big focus on institutions that are too big to fail, again, systemically important institutions. Who's going to make the judgment call as to who makes that list and who doesn't?
Well, that's going to be a complicated combination of the Federal Reserve and the Council of Regulators. And certainly there is a sense that those institutions that someone thinks are sufficiently large, that or sufficiently interconnected, that their failure could do real damage to the system, are going to be watched with special care. That's as it should be.
And is it your sense, is the message to those institutions, if they make this list, listen, you're basically going to be penalized for being so big. It's in your own best interest to get smaller because the government's going to impose certain limits on you. Capital.
I don't think the government's not going to prescribe to any institution what its size should be, but if an institution is large enough or interconnected enough that its failure would pose risks, that's something that's got to be pose risks to taxpayers or pose risks to the system. That's something that's certainly going to be recognized in setting capital requirements and setting capital levels.
If you had to guess, how many institutions in this country would make this list? Just a number.
It's hard enough to try to judge where the economy is without getting into playing guessing games. There'll certainly be a number of such institutions. I don't think you're looking at a very, very large number, but you're looking at more than a few.
Last question. You mentioned the economy. Where are we right now?
I think there's no question that the economy is in a very different place than it was 3 months ago. There's been a lot of normalization. There's obviously a lot still to worry about, and we're going to be watching the economy very carefully, but there's certainly been some normalization relative to where we were a few months ago.
The President told us 10% unemployment. He mentioned that to Al Hunt yesterday. This year, did he get that forecast from Larry Summers?
The President has a wide range of advisors, and look, more seriously, Peter, I think everybody knows and has known for a long time that unemployment is a lagging indicator. And so among the statistics that are last to come around when an economy improves is the unemployment rate. In the last recession, for example, unemployment continued to rise for well over a year past the point when the recession was declared.
National Economic Council Director Larry Summers speaking with me earlier here at the White House about the Obama administration's plan to overhaul regulation of the financial sector. Mark, it's being criticized as going too far, also being criticized as being not enough. Here at the White House, people like Larry Summers think they've struck the right balance. Mark?
Peter Cook at the White House. Peter, thanks.